Welcome back to Sailing El Jaleo. At the end of last week's video, we were in Chesapeake Bay and we had just made it up to Solomons, Maryland. And I believe I've been saying that wrong this entire time. I always say the Solomons. I think it's just my mind trying to make sense out of chaos. But I digress. I believe it is Solomons, and we were anchored in Back Creek. We stayed there for a few days and then we hopped back out into the bay and we made a long run up just south of Annapolis to Road River, where we stayed for one night. The next morning we got back on the road and we headed up underneath the Bainbridge, and we made it all of the way up and we tucked into, I believe this is Still Pond Inlet, and we stayed there for a night before making a short trek the next day to stage ourselves to get through the C&D Canal back to Delaware City. So we stopped for one night right over here in Bohemia River. I think that's about as far as we'll get this week, so we might as well go ahead and get right into it. Grab a drink, climb aboard, and let's get going. Here we are anchored in Back Creek in Solomons, Maryland. We ended up staying here for 4 or 5 days. At the end of last week's video, we did stop at Spring Cove Marina and got a full load of water. We didn't have a ton of dirty laundry, but I wanted to wash the little bit of dirty clothes we had, and I wanted to do all of our bedding, all of the dogs' blankets, all of that stuff. So when we got back to Delaware City, we wouldn't have a huge pile of dirty laundry. I also needed to change the engine oil in our diesel, and there was some bad weather coming in. So on this day when this is being filmed here, there was 30 to 35 knot winds out in the bay, and you never would have known it based upon what was going on back in here. So Back Creek is wonderful. There's a lot of little side creeks in this area. I've never stayed in any of them, but I'm sure they're all just as equally well protected as back in here. We do like this little hole back here. It's kind of our favorite spot. We got some grilling done. You know, we still had some chicken left over from our last big restock down in St. Augustine. Actually it was Volano Beach. But our one freezer, we have 3 different compartments. We have a total of right around 95 quarts of storage, and any one of the 3 can be either fridge or freezer. So we did have a lot of frozen brats, lots of frozen chicken thighs for the dogs, that kind of stuff. So we wanted to burn through a little bit of that. So we grilled every day. We still had some beers left. So I did a little bit of beer drinking back here. There is a spot along the Intracoastal Waterway. It's the Wakawachi Marina in the Waccamaw River. And they're great. If you call them a few days ahead, you know you're going to get there, or if you're going to be passing through. I usually take a bunch of beer with, but you know, you only have so much storage on a boat. You really can't store a lot. So I usually take 5 or 6 cases when I leave Delaware City, and then when I'm getting close to the Wakawachi Marina, I call them like 3 days ahead of time, tell them I want, 6 or 7 cases of whatever, and they'll order it and have it there so you can just duck in quick. Usually I get fuel and water there. They've got some of the best prices for diesel on the entire Intracoastal Waterway, and they can also get you any kind of beer or liquor you want if you call a few days ahead, which is wonderful. It saves me a trip in an Uber, and it's always a pain in the butt to get, cases of beer or, whiskey or whatever back from a store. It's just nice when it's sitting there waiting for you on the dock. And I was a little, this was the first year I had done that, and I was a little worried about the price. Are they going to jack up the price extremely high? And no, it was totally reasonable. It was just a hair more than what you might buy in a store, but that's totally understandable. They're probably not a volume dealer of that kind of stuff, so they I don't think they charged me much more than what they paid for it. So it was a really great service. There's a couple of marinas along the way: Jekyll Island Marina, Wakawachi Marina, and then Atlantic Yacht Basin. They have the best fuel prices all up and down the Intracoastal Waterway. Wakawachi, I love. The people there are super friendly. They can get stuff for you. I've had Amazon packages sent there before. It's just super convenient. Those guys are great. That's a marina you want to keep an eye out for if you're traveling up and down the Intracoastal. After the high wind in Chesapeake Bay had abated, we found a weather window where we could sneak out of the Solomons and make our way up to our next stop, which is in Road River, and that is just south of Annapolis, Maryland. In the olden days, we used to stick to the marked channels, and that is a much longer route. We used to have to stay in Herring Bay. We couldn't make it all the way up to Road River, and Herring Bay is just an awful place to anchor. We stayed there 3 times, and it's basically just an indentation in the side of the bay. There is zero protection unless the wind is blowing from the west or the southwest. That's it. And every other direction is uncomfortable. And also container ships, even though they passed by, 4 or 5 miles from Herring Bay out in Chesapeake Bay, you still get rocked from them. And the boat always seems to be oriented so that the rollers hit you on the beam, and then you're rolling for 5 minutes. Stuff is going flying in the cabin, and that happens every time a tanker goes by. So I would not recommend staying in Herring Bay. It's much easier to bushwhack, go off-road, and make your way up to to Road River, which is what we do now. It's a much better stop. And once we got up to Road River, it was a little bit of I was a little wishy-washy. I had to change the transmission oil for the engine. And so the maintenance on the engine, I have to change the engine oil once every 100 hours. I have to change the transmission oil once every 250 hours. And those are hours that the engine is running. And then there's also a zinc anode, which is in the heat exchanger for the engine. And that's a little more nebulous. When we're traveling, I change that every 150 engine hours, but when we're stationary, that zinc anode is still being consumed, so I have to change it a little more often. So the biggest pain in the butt, I would say, is the transmission oil. And I was waffling a little bit. We were getting really close to being back to Delaware City, and once we got up to Road River, we only had maybe 20 hours left to get back to Delaware City. And we were bumping up against that 250 hours. So I didn't want to change it. I kept thinking, an extra 20 engine hours is not going to kill the transmission oil. The oil always comes out super clean. I've never had a problem with it. And I just wanted to wait until we got back to Delaware City because it would just make everything easier. But ultimately, I decided to do the right thing. And once we got to Road River, it was just going to be an overnight, but it was a long trip to get up there. So as soon as we got there, I started changing the transmission oil, and we got it done before nightfall. And it made for a long day, but I'm glad I did it because, preventative maintenance, you just don't want to take a chance with it. After a peaceful evening in Road River, we got up super early the next morning to try and attempt something that I knew would be impossible, but a person can dream, can't they? We were going to try and make a run from Road River all the way up to Bohemia River. Now, Bohemia River is right on the edge of the C&D Canal. It's about the last place you can anchor before entering the C&D Canal. And we hope to make it up there. It was a 50-mile run. We've never done that before, and I knew it probably wouldn't happen, but that was our goal. And we had contingency plans. There were a couple of places along the way that we could pull off and stop if we had to, so it was no big deal. But, the previous day, in going from Solomon's up to Road River, the conditions had been darn near perfect. It was not so calm that there was no wind, but the wind was just right. It was probably 12 knots right on our beam, so we had a good boost from the wind, but yet it was calm. It was not too choppy, so it was absolutely wonderful. There was cloud cover for about half of the day, which is awesome. And then we were running with the current for about half the day and then against the current for about half. When you're running up a bay or up a river, that's about as good as you're ever going to get. So the previous day had been absolutely perfect. And I knew this day was not going to be perfect. So the wind was not going to be as strong, which meant we would have generally calmer conditions, but we wouldn't get a boost from the wind. We couldn't really use our sails. Or the wind was going to be coming from a direction that was not usable for us. And the other thing was today we were going to be running against the current for most of the day, which really stinks. There are a couple of choke points going right underneath the Bainbridge, And then once you get further up the bay, it does narrow down quite a bit. And in those areas, you know, going underneath the Bainbridge, I think we were going like 1.5 knots against the current, so that was really frustrating. And then, you know, it opens up once you get north of the Bainbridge, so then we picked up a little speed. We were going between 2.5 to 2.8 knots, which is still frustrating, but you know, at least you're making some progress. And then from there, it did narrow out. But by then we were getting close to the tide turning, so I think we made it up maybe 35 to 40 miles. It was another long run. It was somewhere around there, 37 miles. But we didn't make it up to Bohemia River, which was not too big of a surprise. I wasn't really expecting to make it there. It was kind of a, you know, what do you call it? A pie in the sky? That doesn't sound right, but whatever. It was a dream that we didn't achieve. But we pulled off, and I forget the name of the inlet that we pulled off into. It was in the beginning. I apologize, brain fart, but we pulled off there for one night. And that's all we have time for this week. I would like to give a massive shout out to my Patreon crew. Without your guys' support, I wouldn't make these videos. And my Patreon crew is Joan and Juddy Judnick, Val and Chris Alcorn, Denise and Eli Sackett, Sherry Erickson, Deb Shaw, Matthew Spotton, Peter Allen, and Natalie Linehan. Thank you guys so very much. Your support really means the world to me. I do have one legacy patron member, and her name is Joan Linbo. Unfortunately, she has passed on, but she lives on in our hearts forever. We really miss you, Joan. If you are interested in joining our Patreon crew, there is a link in the description down below, and that'll take you to our Patreon page where you can sign up. And there are hundreds, literally hundreds of extra videos and photos of our travels, and I try and keep everything there up to date and post at least once or twice a week, so it gives you a little peek behind the curtain. If you do like our videos, please like, comment, and subscribe. That'll help us out more than you'll ever know, and that actually doesn't cost you anything, so hit that like button. Alrighty, I hope you all are well, and we'll see you next week.